5 Englishmen are sitting around, and they're telling about their adventures, and one says, and yes, we were in India, and we were hunting tiger, and as we walked through the bush, a giant tiger jumped out at me, and I shit in my pants. And he says, well, naturally, if something like that happens. He says, no, not then. Just now, when I went, I shit in my pants. My name is Howard Albrecht. Actually, it's Jerome Howard Albrecht, but my parents never cared for the word Jerome. We had a Jerome Avenue in the Bronx. I was born in the Bronx, and I lived there for about 30 years of my life before we moved into the suburbs. I was born on April 24th, 1926, and we lived in various places in the Bronx. Great place to live then. I don't know about now. I haven't been back there for many, many years. First, we lived in the East Bronx. That's where most of the Jewish immigrants moved. That was moving uptown from the Lower East Side or Harlem or wherever they lived. And I lived on 172nd Street near Boston Road, and lived there till I was about 9 years old. And then we moved to the West Bronx. That was a big step up. We lived on DeKalb Avenue, and I remember I was 9 years old, and I had to have my appendix taken out. And in those days, you went to a hospital, and you were there for 10 days. And when I came home, I was living in a different apartment. My family had moved. They told me where they were going to go, luckily, otherwise I would still be in the Bronx hospital. And I lived across the street from the public school that I went to, PS 94. That went up to the 6th grade, and the neighborhood was comprised of probably 3 or 4 streets, and there was no supermarkets. I'm talking about the 30s. There were no big supermarkets. If you wanted to buy groceries, there was a grocery store. If you wanted to buy fruits, you went across to a fruit store, a bakery, there was a drugstore on the corner. Now we do it all in one shot. And it was a neighborhood where you knew everybody. We had a lot of friends. You'd get up in the morning to have breakfast, you'd go out, and you were out the whole day practically. Maybe you came home for a little lunch, or sometimes you called up and your mother threw a peanut butter and jelly sandwich wrapped in a brown paper bag out the window, and you were able to eat it while you were sitting on the stoop. And I remember I belonged to an athletic team called the Red Wings, because we played roller hockey. We always liked the Detroit Red Wings. So we played hockey in the street, sewer to sewer. We played the classic was always stickball, curveball, all the games that we played, Ringalivio, hide and go seek. And it was a wonderful place to grow up. There was not a lot of traffic, so you could play in the streets. There was no talk of predators coming in. It was just a nice neighborhood, a middle-class neighborhood, and it was a great place to grow up. So my father was born here, and he lived also in the East Bronx, where most Jewish families lived at that time. I think maybe the West Bronx was farms, for all I know. When he was born in 1900. By the way, my father's name was Solomon, and Albrecht. He was a nice guy, very good looking, handsome. He had 3 brothers, so they all lived together in a basement apartment. My grandfather, my grandmother. I used to say my father lived together with his 3 brothers, and they all slept in one bed. He didn't get to sleep alone until he married my mother. We were in the retail business. When you're in the retail business, you're working night and day. So I never saw my father a lot. He would come home. He was a strong presence there. If I did something wrong, my mother would take the wire out of of an iron and come swinging it at me. And I would scream and yell and jump under the bed. If my father came home and found out what I did, he didn't talk to me. And that was the terrible thing. If he didn't talk to you, you could beat me, put nails under my feet, but if he didn't talk, that was the worst kind of punishment. Unfortunately, he had a heart attack when he was 39 years old. I remember him being home for a long time. In those days, you had a heart attack, the only thing they could give you was Coumadin to give you a blood thinner. That was about it. So he worked, but came winter time, he went to Florida for a couple of months, and the family stayed home. So he was there doing God knows what. All I know is I have pictures of him and his friends who were also down there, and they were just great-looking guys, and they were all in their early 40s. So I come to the conclusion, as my wife always said, your father fooled around plenty, believe me. Anyway, but he was someone that I always respected and had a great deal of feeling for. My mother was maybe more of a confidant for me. I could tell her, you know, I didn't really go to school today. I cut school and went down and I saw a Danny Kaye at the Roxy or something. I would never say that to my father because he would be angry at me. My mother was born in Russia. She was 2 years old when she came to this country. She was born in 1904. Her name was Ada Rabinowitz. Originally, I think it was Ida Rabinowitz, but she wanted to Americanize it, so she changed it to Ada. And her father came here in 1905, and then he sent for his wife, my grandmother. In 1906, so my grandmother came here carrying my mother in her arms, and she came with her mother-in-law. And they lived in like most immigrant Jews, they lived in the East Side, in the Lower East Side. My grandfather had a job in a laundry, and they finally had some success, and they moved up to Harlem. My mother was a fun lady. She was a good dancer. My father met her when she was 15 years old, and he was 19, in a place in the Bronx called Hunts Point Palace. I think it's still there. I think they're still dancing in Hunts Point Palace. They're not doing Charleston. I think they're doing a cha-cha-cha, but anyway, he married my mother, I think in 1925. They got married, and she was, 21 years old, and he was 4 years older. I don't know too much about my grandparents on my father's side, except what I know, the modern things. I mean, when I say modern, I mean when I was 5 years old and 6 like there, I know a lot about them, but I don't know about their background. My grandmother came from Hungary. I don't know when she came, but it was before she got married, so she must have been a teenager. She had 2 sisters and her grandmother and her mother. And I knew her mother. She was my great-grandmother, so I knew her. In fact, I knew my great-grandmother on both my mother and my father's side, which was kind of nice. Now, I mean, at the time, I didn't know. I was 4 or 5 years old, and somebody was putting me on their lap, giving me a piece of bread and butter, so it was nice. My grandfather and grandmother, they struggled. They had 4 kids. My father was the oldest, Solomon. Then there was Benjamin. Then there was Edward. And then there was Emmanuel. My grandfather, when he first came here, worked in sweatshops, and he made pants, he sewed pants. He was once fired because he made pants without pockets. They were getting piecework money, And they said, there's no pockets in these pants. And he said, the people that can afford these pants, they don't have anything to put in pockets anyway. So why do they need pockets, you know? Anyway, he got fired, and somewhere along the line, he brought in a nephew from Hungary. This nephew would buy stockings from someplace, maybe Seconds, and on Sunday, he would stand at the bottom of the stairs that led up to the L, the 3rd Avenue L, and when people came down, he would be selling stockings. And he made some good money, and he said to my grandfather, why don't you do that on the side? Because he was working in his sewing. So he did that, and he started making a living selling stockings. So he felt he would do better if he could get a push cart. In the Bronx, there was a place called Bathgate Avenue, which was like Orchard Street in New York, in Manhattan. And he had a push cart where he sold lady stockings. At that time, it was probably Lyle cotton stockings, and he'd sell bloomers, ladies' bloomers. And night and day. I mean, they would be out there in the winter, and it's cold and rainy. He would put newspaper in his coat so that the wind wouldn't come through him. And that's how he made a living. They lived in a basement apartment nearby, and they had stockings hanging in the window. And if someone went by and with a sign and they needed stockings, they could go in, and my grandmother would sell them a pair of stockings. Well, my father got married, and I was born in 1926, and my father was driving a taxi. And my grandfather was very upset. He was driving at night. You're out all night, and you have a baby in the house, and let's open up a store, and you'll be in the store with me. So they opened up a store on Bathgate Avenue, because there were stores, and then there were push carts. And so it was like 8 feet wide and about probably 50 feet deep, and my father and my grandfather. Well, as luck would have it, about 2 blocks up the street was a telephone company. And in those days, if you wanted a number, you didn't dial it. There was no buttons, there was no dials. You picked up the phone and said, give me Gramercy 3, 8300, and the operator would do it. There were hundreds of lady operators who all had to walk past our store to get to the subway to get home. Well, now I had my father and 3 brothers, one better looking than the other, all good looking guys. They were all hanging around the store, and the women would be coming in, and they were buying stockings and bloomers and whatever else they started to sell. And the first year they were in business, they did $125,000. This is 1929, 28, no taxes, I don't think. I mean, how long has this been going on? So there was 4 sons. They immediately opened another store not too far away on Wilkins Avenue, and one of the sons went in there, and they opened up another store, and pretty soon we had a chain of stores, Albrecht stores, throughout the Bronx, Brooklyn, Manhattan. We had stores in Connecticut, New Jersey. When I left the business, we had about 18 stores. And because of those 4 sons, my grandfather was successful in business, and they took over. And so he was only like 50, 55 years old, and he was retired. And he lived in the Bronx. He had a house where he had 2 stories were his house. There was a kitchen and bedrooms downstairs. There was a living room and other things upstairs. And then he rented out the top apartment just to make sure that he would have enough money to live on. And I remember as a kid, I used to go to their house, and I remember they had a stall shower, which I had never seen. I must have been 7 years old. A stall shower with a glass door, because our showers were always a bathtub with a curtain. And I was so thrilled by that. And I remember my grandmother, I must have been younger than 7. My grandmother put me in the shower and she took a washcloth and she said, "You see this? This is what you got to do every time you take a shower." And she gave my ass a wipe. My grandfather was always called Pop. Pop Albrecht. He was Pop in the business. He was Pop, till he was 85. He lived in New Rochelle. He came down to the office every morning and opened the office. We had offices and stock rooms, and he opened it up, and he stayed there till about 11:30, 12 o'clock, walking around, kibitzing with the stock boys and the girls, picking up things. I remember he would be picking up cartons and breaking them up so that they wouldn't fill the garbage up too fast. He doing little things that he thought he was doing just to keep busy. Then he'd get on the train, and he'd go back to New Rochelle. And one day he fainted in the office. I remember I was working there already. I was in my 20s, I guess. And I ran down to get some brandy, and we gave him some brandy. In those days, there was no 911. If you called an ambulance, it was already, you were dying. And so they said, why don't you take Grandpa home? I said, okay. And he said, no, you don't have to take me home, but I'll go with you to Grand Central Station where you'll get the train. So he went to the counter and he bought a token for 10 cents. So I said, well, why do you buy a token every time? You come down here 5 days a week. Why don't you buy 10 tokens and that's it? He said, I got to be a warehouse for these guys. But they were remarkable people. They came here with nothing. They never spoke. They couldn't speak the language, and they made a life for themselves, their children, and certainly their grandchildren. I went to Dewitt Clinton High School in the Bronx. It was during the war. It was from 1941 till 1944. When you went to an all-boys high school, it was very difficult to get hooked up with a woman. Where did you find women? In fact, I even joined the cheerleading squad, and I became the captain of the cheerleaders because I had visions of going to other high schools and cohabitating with other cheerleaders. So what would happen is I became a pool player and hung out with guys, and this was a time where you wore sort of, I don't want to say zoot suits because we weren't that wild, but the pants were pegged and it was high with a big Windsor knot, and you'd meet at the pool room and you wore a hat. What do you want to do? I don't know, what are you going to do? And so we'd go to a dance. We'd go downtown, jump on the subway, we'd go to City Center at dances, or Manhattan Center. And of course you would find a girl. I mean, the first thing you'd find out is, where are they from? If they were from Brooklyn, you would pass them by because they were just, you don't want to get involved with a girl from Brooklyn. You live in the Bronx, it's going to take you 2 hours to get home at night, and your pants are going to be wet, so it's no good. During the war, I was not drafted. I was 4F, so I worked in a defense plant in the Bronx. Not like the defense plants that people are used to seeing in Los Angeles, a big sprawling thing. This was a punch press place where they took metal. We made lanterns for the Navy, and we made other little things. And I remember I started off, I got a job there, and I was pushing a broom, and I was making about 60 cents an hour, and I could make time and a half on Saturday and double time on Sunday. And I remember one of the punch press guys said to me, why don't you learn how to work a punch press? This was these big presses that came down, you put a piece of metal in and whack down on you. He says, why don't you learn how to use a punch press? He says, you could make 4 times as much money as you make now. And I looked down and I saw 2 fingers missing from the punch press, obviously, and that was the last time I went near a punch press. And so when the war was over, I was already 19 years old. I went to college, and just then I get called for another physical. I said, "Oh God, the war's over, and they're going to lower the standards, and I'm going to have to go into the Army." Well, I took the physical about the end of September, and again I failed, and I had this bad knee that used to lock on me, and I failed, and so I wanted to go to school, but all the schools had started. And so I went down to the College Advisory Board at Rockefeller Center, and I said, I want to take a business administration course with maybe accounting because of the stores. I knew I was going to go into that business. And is there any school that has not started yet? So they said, well, there's 2 schools. It's LIU in Long Island University or Rider College in Trenton, New Jersey. Well, I didn't want to go to LIU because that meant I would be living home and I would be on the subway. And I wanted to get away from my friends that I had there. I wanted to get away from the Bronx. I wanted to go someplace and see something. Trenton, New Jersey sounded good. It was only an hour away on the train. And so I went there, and in college is where I met my wife. Bernice came from a small town in upstate New York, Malone, New York. But even though she came from this small town, she got it. When I used to say something or try to say something funny, whatever it is, she got it. Where other girls, no matter who they were or what they were, they were New Yorkers, but they were not particularly understanding. She was smart, she was good looking, she was different. I don't know, it was an attraction right away. Bernice took a course in medical secretary in Rider College, and it was a 3-year course, and she did it in 2 years because we used to go summers. And so I was still in school when she was living in New York, and she was working for doctors in New York City. And I would come in every weekend and see her, and she'd stay at my house for the weekend, and we were going together. And this was going on for about a year or so. And I had a roommate who lived in Newark, and also had this girl that he was seeing for a long time, and they got engaged. So one Friday after school, I got on the train and I came back to New York, and I would pick Bernice up at her doctor's office, and then we'd ride on the subway together, and we're both standing there holding on. And I said, oh, by the way, Cookie, that was our friend, Cook Marvin Drazen, Cookie and Cookie got engaged. And she said, that's nice. And a big bulb lit up over my head. Oh shit, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. So I asked her to marry me, and she said, okay. And I remember we went to the Samaritz Hotel. At that time they had the Samaritz roof. The 2 of us, we went there, we had, drinks, dinner, we stood on the end, we looked out at New York. Someday this will all be yours, I said, or whatever bullshit I said. And we got engaged. And then what happened was, we were in the Korean War, and I was afraid I was going to get drafted again. I said, now when everything is over, I'm going to get drafted. So I joined the National Guard. If you joined by 12 o'clock a certain night, you would not have to even think about going into the Army. If the National Guard was called up, you would have to go with them. So I decided to join the National Guard. I remember I went to the Kingsbridge Armory. There were guys around the corner lined up, and they were checking them in, took a certain amount, and 12 o'clock came around, and that was the deadline, and if you didn't get in then, you couldn't get in, and that was it. And then the sergeant came out, and he said, who here can type? And I raised my hand, as a couple other people did. I learned how to type in Rider College. That was part of the prerequisite course. You had to learn how to type, and you had to learn how to have good penmanship because you were going to be an accountant. And so I learned that. And then he said, who knows the Dewey Decimal System? And nobody raised their hand. And I had worked in the library at DeWitt Clinton for about 2 weeks, so I knew what the Dewey Decimal System was. And I raised my hand and I said, I'm an expert in the Dewey Decimal System. So he said, okay, you're going to be the company clerk. And I got into the National Guard. And so that summer, we had to go to camp 2 weeks. We went to what was called Pine Camp at that time. I don't know what it is now, Camp Drum or something like that in Watertown. And I got a letter from Bernice saying, we're getting married on December 4th. We found a place. It was the Riverside Plaza Hotel. And we had a big wedding with, ushers and bridesmaids and gowns and full dress suits. My brother was there and my father and mother. And I have a picture of the dais and everybody is gone. Well, I had a brother who was 4 years younger than me, Bobby. Blonde, blue-eyed. He had my father's Hungarian good looks, and we were very close. We were both in the business together. He was my brother. We were close. We did a lot of things together, and I was out here. It was 1972, and I got a phone call. Bernice was working for a doctor. I got a phone call from my mother was living in Florida by herself. My father had died in 68, and I got a phone call from her neighbor that my brother was killed in an automobile accident driving from Florida. He was there playing golf, he and his wife. His kid got in some kind of trouble back at home, and they were driving, and they drove, and he was in an accident around Orlando. I remember flying to Florida and picking up my mother, and then stopping in Tampa to pick up his wife. He was killed instantly driving. His wife had a couple of ribs broken, and that was about it. My daughter was born in 1950. We very rarely had girls in our family. All my cousins were boys. A girl was a miracle to have a girl in the family. My mother was so thrilled. We were all thrilled. She was this beautiful little girl. The trouble was that it took her 32 hours. Bernice was in labor for 32 hours. And finally, the doctor said you had to have a cesarean. And the kids grew up mostly. We lived in the Bronx when she was 6 years old, and my son was 3 years old. We bought a house in New Rochelle, Westchester, New York, and they went to school there. And she had a tumultuous teenage life. She went to college in 1968, which, if you remember, was a rough year. There was riots. There were all kinds of hippies, Haight-Ashbury, drugs, anger, SDS, everything. She went to college in Syracuse because we lived in New York. We thought, she wanted to go there. Unfortunately for her, we moved here, and now we were so far away, and she wasn't that thrilled with Syracuse. She left there, and so she went to UC Riverside. And in Riverside, I think she got involved with everybody that didn't want to go to school. And she was in trouble. I had to get her bail her out of jail once or twice. And the difficult time was when she said, we are moving out of the country. She had this black boyfriend and a lot of other friends, and this is not a good country for us, and we're going to live on a commune. And she was 19 years old, and I said, I don't want you to do that. Bernice and I were both very, very upset by it, but she was 19 years old. I mean, what are you going to do? And the next time I got in touch with her was maybe a month later. She sent a letter, and they were living in Canada, somewhere north of Toronto or something like that. And I was determined not to be a judgmental father who wrote a letter with do's and don'ts. I just wanted it to be easy. I wanted to keep up. I still wanted to have a daughter. I didn't want to say, I don't have a daughter anymore. Some people that said that. When it first happened, I was having breakfast, and I had a psychiatrist friend. And I said to him, I got to see you, whether it's professionally or I got to see you, or I got to talk to you. I mean, it was very, very difficult. And I told him the story, and he said, look, your daughter went to college, she has an education, she speaks the language, she knows about things, she can pick up a telephone. She says, your grandparents came here, they didn't know the language, they didn't know anything, and they survived. She'll survive. So I felt a little better, and I felt, yeah, and she did survive. She called, and she said, I want to come home. Somebody in the group wanted to become the head of the group. He wanted all the women to be married to all the men so that everybody could be having sex with each other. She was not into that, and she wanted to come home. I said, stay where you are. Where are you? But stay there. Give me the phone number. It was a telephone booth in Toronto, I think. And I got a hold of a travel agent who arranged tickets. And that night, I picked her up at the airport. 3 scraggly-looking people, you know. But my daughter was home, and I was happy that she was home. My son lived in the same house, in the same place. His room had a 2x4 wall between it. They were like day and night. He was straight and narrow. He went to Beverly Hills High School. He loved to play sports, but he was too small, because when he was a kid, he used to say to Bernice, will I ever be 5 feet tall? And she said, I guarantee you'll be 5 feet tall. Guaranteed. After that, you're on your own, but I guarantee you'll be 5 feet tall. We came out here. He had no friends here, and he was in high school, and they don't make friends easily, kids in high school, or especially in Beverly Hills. I remember I would drive him to Beverly Hills High School, and Thunderbirds and Mercedes were pulling up, and we were in a little Volkswagen, and he was driving a bicycle with a backpack before backpacks became fashionable. I knew he was lonely because he was getting straight A's. So that meant that he had no friends. In fact, once he brought home a friend and I didn't know what to do with them. I took him to Dolores. I bought him apple pie and ice cream. I didn't know what to do for them. He had a friend. And he was Mr. Straight and Narrow. He played golf. He got on the golf team. He was a good golfer. He went to UC Santa Barbara. He came to me one day when he was still in school. He was an economics major for want of something else. And he said, I don't know what I want to do. He said, I'm going to graduate in a year. I don't know what I want to be. I says, well, I don't know what to tell you except you figure out something that you're going to be passionate about. Something that you really want to do, because you're going to have to do a lot of it. I said, now you don't have to get rich, but you got to have make enough money. You want to go to a movie once in a while. You want to get married. You want to maybe live in a house someplace or have a car. I said, you got to be able to do that. But after that, it's got to be something that you really want to do. So he came back a couple of weeks later, and he said, I'd like to be a writer for television. So I said, well, it's possible. If I could be a writer for television, you could be a writer for television. I said, what you got to do is you got to write. That's how you learn how to write. You got to keep writing. I had graduated from school, had the diploma. I came in, my father gave me a broom and said, now you're going to start. And I worked in stores. I worked every place. And I worked there for 20 years. And about maybe 17 years later, I was approaching the age of 40, and I was getting this, is this it for the rest of my life? Is this it? You get that 40-ish feeling. I don't know if people get it now. Maybe they get it older now. Everybody, the 60 is the new 40, they said. Anyway, and so one day, we were living in New Rochelle, and one day I was getting ready to come home. I was on 45th Street and Madison Avenue, ready to cross the street, waiting for the light to change. I was headed for Grand Central Station, where I would get my commuter train back up to New Rochelle. And two guys were standing next to me, and one was wearing this English coat with the velvet lapels and a little derby hat. And I happened to be listening to them. And he said, well, so long. See you in Nairobi. And I said to my mind, I'll never be able to say that to anyone in my entire life. I said I could say, see you on Fordham Road in the Bronx, because we had a store there, or see you on 181st Street in Washington Heights, because we had a store there, or I could see you in Pitkin Avenue in Brooklyn, or I could even see you in Poughkeepsie, New York. We had a store there, or Stamford, Connecticut. I could never say, see you in Nairobi. And I started to get depressed. And like for 3 years, I was sort of depressed. It was like, oh shit, I got to go to work Monday. And I would get a pain in my stomach. Oh, the weekend is over. And I was not happy with the people that I knew up in New Rochelle. They were joining country clubs, and they were at the bar, and they were all coming on to each other's wives, and I was not interested in doing that kind of shit. And that was it. And then we built a store in New Haven, and I was very much involved in building the stores, worked with the architects and all that. And then after the store was built, Bernice and I went on a trip to Europe. Our first trip was 1967. We went to Amsterdam, London, Paris. And when we came home, my friend Sheldon, who had lived on the street, who we were friends with, who knew that I always wanted to write, he would write for Jack Carter and Jan Murray and various people during the summer, and I would always pitch in and help him. I was in the retail business, but I was helping him write funny stuff. He called and he spoke to Bernice first, and he said, I'm going to ask Howard a question. This is the question. If you don't want me to ask him, I won't ask him. So she said, well, it's up to him. Whatever he wants to do, I'll go along with him. So then he said to me, I'm going to be producing the Jonathan Winter Show on NBC, and I think you could be a writer, and I'd like to hire you to come out here. We'll hire you for 4 shows. We're going to do 15. We'll hire you for 4 shows. If we don't like you, we'll fire you. If you don't like us, you can quit, and that's it. So I talked it over with my brother. It was already October, November. This is our busy time, coming into Christmas. And what should I do? This is something that I always wanted to do. When I was in college, I used to put on shows in college. During the war, I was in the USO as a stand-up comic, entertaining in various camps around New York City, Stage Door Canteen. And my brother says, you got to give it a shot. Why not? So I came out to California. He flew me out October 12th, I remember, 1967. He introduced me to the head of West Coast programming, Perry Lafferty, out here at CBS. And then he took me over to Toluca Lake, and I met Jonathan Winters. I remember we drove past Bob Hope's house. Bob Hope had always been like an idol to me when I was a kid, and he showed me where the house was, and he hired me, and I came out here on October 28th. I lived at the Sunset Marquis. It was $375 for a little apartment for a month, $375 a month. And now I think it's every hour it's $375. And I worked. I was frightened. Here I'm working with guys. I recognize their names. They had credits up their arm, an arm's worth of credits, and I'm working with these guys. He put me together with a young writer named Ron Friedman, whom I always thanked because he really carried me along. And we wrote for Jonathan, and Jonathan knew who I was, and he used to say, you don't care whether we get picked up or not. You'll go back to your little stores in New York, and and I said, I used to say, those stores, they do $10 million a year business, I always wanted to give them a little spritz. But what happened was, we got picked up for the second season. We were a big hit, and because my friend knew how to work with Jonathan. Jonathan was, you had to have a little bit of him, not a lot. You couldn't live with 60 minutes of him. Well, they had a whole big argument and a whole big fight, and of course Perry Lafferty said, this is the Jonathan Winter show, not the Sheldon Keller show, and so Sheldon Keller left, and when he left, Jonathan fired everybody that had anything to do with Sheldon Keller. I was the first one to get fired. So here, on April whatever, I came home with a job starting in June. We were going to move out here, and I was going to have a job, and now, no job, no nothing. I had credits, 15 shows, but that was it. So what should I do? Should I go back to the business? I didn't want to do that. So we decided, with Bernice's help, we decided that we were going to give it a try, give it a year. I said, being a freelance writer means you're out of work anyway, all the time. So we'll give it a shot. And if not, my brother said, you could come back. I don't think they were that happy to get me back after I left. They were pretty pissed off that I left. I was the oldest. I was the heir apparent to run the business. They were all in their 60s and 70s. My father, he was very upset that I left the business because I'm leaving something that he worked for his whole life, and I'm treating it like it's nothing. So it was very difficult. I did get a letter from him saying that if this is what I want to do, then give it all you have, give it a shot, And I remember 2 years later, for the first 2 years, I really didn't work too much. I think I made $7,000 in 2 years. My brother had worked something out where I got a couple of $100 a week from the business, and that was it. I knew I needed a partner. I needed somebody so that when I could stop talking, they could pick it up. And Sheldon was producing the Engelbert Humperdinck show in London. He couldn't hire me because they had some kind of regulations that they could only hire one American writer. And so he was the American writer, and that was it. So he came back and he said, Alan Drake was a comic who was on the show, and he said he has this writer, Saul Weinstein, who had been writing for comics. He was a journalist. He had a column in the Trenton, as luck would have it, he came from Trenton, New Jersey, and I never knew him when I went to college there. And he is coming, he wants to work as a writer in television. It's difficult for him to get started, but he's very funny. And he had just written a series of books called the Israel Bond books. James Bond was the big thing, and he did the Jewish James Bond, Oi Oi 7. And they were very funny. To this day, they're funny. And he came out here looking for work. So we met in a deli on Pico, at the Bagel, and Saul had Tourette's syndrome. And that's why he had such difficulty in working in certain places. And he said, look, I have met with Milton Berle, and Milton wants me to do a piece for him. Why don't we write it together? I said, okay, fine. And we'll see if we can write together. So we wrote this piece for Milton, and he said he'll take it home and retype it, and then we'll see Milton at NBC tomorrow. So I said, okay, come to the house, and then we'll go together, And I said, let me see the piece. And he reached into his back pocket and he took out this folded up 4 or 5 pieces of paper with the typing rubbed out with a black pencil, with written on there, with a coffee stain. I said, we're going to ask this man to give us $1,500 for this. He says, but it's very funny. I said, sure, it's funny, but you got to have a little presentation too. So I retyped it and I put 4 jokes on a page, and we went to a Xerox place and we Xeroxed it so we'd have more copies, and we brought, and that was our relationship throughout our 20 years together. I was in the showroom and he was in the back in the factory, and we wrote together. We were very successful as journeyman writers. We worked on a lot of variety shows. We did 15 years of Dean Martin roasts, Dinah Shaw and Milton Berle and other people. And then one day, we realized there's no more variety shows, and we had never written a sitcom. So we decided that Chico and Man would be the show that we could possibly work on, because these 2 guys were both comics, and they were doing routines together. We could write that kind of stuff. We wrote something for Freddie Prinze for a roast, and it was very good. It worked well. So we went to Chico and the Man with ideas, and we saw the Mike Morris, I think, was the producer. We pitched ideas, and he didn't particularly care for any of the ideas. But I said, can I call you? Rather than bother you, let me call you on the phone if we have any new ideas. It's fine. So I used to call him every day. Hey, Mike, Chico gets the clap, you know. One day he said, look, I know you guys can write this. I have an idea for something. We came up there. He gave us the idea. We wrote it. It was good. They liked it. They bought it. It was the first show we ever wrote. We wrote a second one. We introduced a new character. And we had done a special for 2 producers, Bernie Rothman and Jack Wall, Words and Music. It was about singing, and Danny Thomas was on it, and Anthony Newley, and everybody was on it. And we were the only writers. We wrote some very good stuff for it. And so they were doing a sitcom, and they hired us as story editors on the strength of that one script and who they knew we were. And from then on, we worked steadily. Sal had these 4 books published, so we got an idea when The Godfather was the big book that we're going to write a book called The Oddfather. And I said to Sal, we got to write 10 pages every day, no matter what. If we write 10 pages and it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we quit. If it's 12 o'clock in the afternoon, we quit. If it's 2 o'clock in the morning, we got to stay there till that. We're going to write 10 pages every day, because we're going to finish in 2 weeks, and then we're going to have a week for going it over and redoing something. So we wrote every day. He would come to here, and we were working on a show at the time, so we would, like, in between we were writing. But Saul was a journalist who wrote a column. He could sit down and write like that. I could only write sketches and jokes and stuff like that. So he got at the type. Usually I was at the typewriter, but this time he was at the typewriter, and he would. That's why our credit was always written by Howard Albrecht and Saul Weinstein. But when we did books, it was written by Saul Weinstein and Howard Albrecht. In 1973, we had written 3 books, and they were all published. And it was a big thrill to go into Martindale's, which was the bookstore. It was Hunter and Martindale's, and I went into Martindale's, and on the shelf was our book, The Oddfather. The trouble was, we should have said Albrecht and Weinstein, because it was all the way down at the bottom where the W's were, and it could have been up here at eye level where the A's were for Albrecht. So I used to go into the theater, take the books, and I used to bring them to the counter, and I used to stand them. I said, why don't you keep these at the counter? People are going to love this book. So we wrote 4 books together. We wrote The Exorcist, when The Exorcist came out. We wrote The Exorciser, a woman possessed by the demon of gluttony. Only the exerciser could help her. We wrote that for Ballantine Books in New York, and they sent us on a tour. We did 10 cities in 18 days. When you're a writer, it takes you 5 years to realize that you're retired. You don't realize it. So you keep pushing, you keep going in and pitching your pilots and ideas. And I started a thing called Funny Stuff from the Gags Gang, which was a joke letter, because I had all these friends who were on strike and could write jokes. Stan Burns, who wrote for everybody, Pat McCormick, everybody knew Pat McCormick, Jeffrey Barron, Saul wrote wonderful jokes. So Sheldon and I, we started this paper called Funny Stuff from the Gags Gang, which we sold for $125 a year throughout the country in English-speaking countries. And we did it for 15 years. We never made a dime. We paid all our bills. But I always said I made a lot of money doing that, because if I didn't do that, I would be having lunches, which would cost me money. I would probably be out having an affair with somebody. I would have to go to a psychiatrist. I said, I guarantee you, I made like $800-900 a week of not spending money by doing that, by meeting at his house and writing it. And when Sheldon got Alzheimer's and could no longer stay in his house by himself, we decided to call it quits. And he went into an assisted living home, and we stopped doing the printing it. And then I realized I missed writing those topical jokes every week. So I said, let me do it. By then, computers were big, the internet was big. Let me do it on the internet, and I'll send it to my friends free. I'll do it every week. And I've been doing it for the past 9 years. So altogether, Funny Stuff from the Gags Gang, that started as a lark, has been around for 25 years. I'm 87 years old, and I had a wonderful opportunity to change a career and to go from something that I liked, and I had my good days and enjoyment, but I had an opportunity to do something that I wanted to do all my life as a kid. And I was successful at it. I regret that we didn't become more successful as producers or something like that. But Saul, as I said, had this Tourette syndrome, and I don't know, maybe I wasn't that talented. I certainly wasn't that political, and you have to be very political to get into some of these things. Our great joy was to close the door and write, not be out smooching with the star so that we could become the producer of the show next year, as some people I know did. And so if there's any regrets, it's that we didn't do better, but I had a great time. As I said, when I was 16, I loved Bob Hope, and now one day I'm in my 40s, and I have to go to Bob Hope's house because we're working on a Bob Hope special, and I walk in through the office. There's an office outside, and then you go in an alleyway, and you go into his house, and you lead into some foyer, and there's a guy standing at the other end, and I remember thinking, oh my God, there's a guy who looks just like Bob Hope, because I couldn't believe that I was really going to be sitting with Bob Hope. And all my life I saw Milton Berle at the Low State Theater and wherever in New York, listened to him on television. People came up to our house, as was the cliche, and everybody sat around and watched television. Our stores closed early because Tuesday night everybody watched television. And now I'm sitting with Milton Berle, and he's leaning over and saying, and I'm in the business about 4 minutes, and he's in the business his whole life, and he leans over and he said, Howard, you think if I say it this way, it'll be funnier? And I'm saying in my head, Milton Berle is asking me how to say something funny.